Okay, so we seem to have a reasonably good cohort, so I'll get going if that's okay. So my name is Dermot O'Connor, and as I said to you in the Slack message, I will be taking the first half of this module, and my colleague Frank will take the latter half of it. So I'm just going to dive straight in, really, if that's all right. I'm going to share my screen with you. And let's see how we get on. I'm also gonna turn off my camera, but at any stage during any of our lectures, just feel free to interrupt me with if you've got questions. I prefer that approach rather than typing stuff into the message feature within Zoom, if that's okay. So don't be shy, just feel free to interrupt, and I'll try and deal with whatever questions you have. So let me see now. I'm going to turn off some stuff here. And I might just get confirmation from you that you can see my browser at this stage.
Yeah, you can see that, don't you?
Okay, so this is the website that we're going to use, and we're going to publish all our material here, both lectures, slides, lecture recordings, lab exercises. So as we work our way through the module, a new card will be added essentially each week. Right, so today I'm just going to give a quick overview of the module, and then we'll get into what I might call one of the foundation topics, which is JavaScript, and then we'll get into the more substantial material. I'd say I'm going to need about 2 weeks, or maybe a bit less than 2 weeks, to cover the JavaScript material. Like, we're assuming everybody is a competent programmer. We're not assuming that everybody knows or has used JavaScript. We kind of have to make that base assumption. So I am going to go through a review of JavaScript fairly quickly. I'm sure you're going to pick it up because, programming is programming, essentially. So it shouldn't be an issue, I don't think. So today, at the beginning anyway, I'm going to go into this card here. And all that's here is just a set of slides. I'm sure you've browsed around the website now once I gave you the link to it there last week. So the slides are these here. Right, I'm a bit clumsy at the start. Sorry about that. So kind of by way of a one-liner, if you like. Oh my God, sorry. Right, this is my one-liner objective of the overall module: to design, implement, and deploy performance-secure client-side rendering web apps using industry standard frameworks and tools. Now, really, the only term there that might be unfamiliar to you is this notion of client-side rendering web apps. We know what a web app is. It's an app that we access via a browser, but what exactly do we mean by client-side rendering? That's going to be a characteristic throughout this module. The module is very much practical oriented. So hence, we're talking about implementing and designing and implementing. That's going to be a key factor. So each week, really, there will be a fairly significant practical related lab exercise. We'll see those as we work our way through. So I need to give you the context for what I mean by client-side rendering, because there are alternative designs other than client-side. Then we'll talk about the module specifically, and we'll also just briefly mention some software that you need to install in order to work your way through the labs and the assignments. So the context first for this whole module. By the way, I probably should have said the module is titled Enterprise Web App Development, or is it Enterprise Web Development? Enterprise Web Development. The use of the word enterprise there is not significant. We included that in the title really for kind of admin purposes, I suppose. So I wouldn't be overly concerned with what that particularly refers to. So it's more kind of web development. That's the key part of this module. We included enterprise to satisfy some external companies that were interested in doing the masters. So that's kind of the background that you really don't need to know about or care about. Right. So I use the term client-side rendering there in the one-liner. Now, web apps have been around for quite a while. They kind of date back really to the early noughties. And back then, the architecture, we would say, of the web apps were client-side rendering. That wasn't a term that was used back then because it was the only form of the web app architecture. But more recently, as in around from 2010 onwards, there has been an alternative architecture, and it's this alternative architecture that we will be focusing on. But to give you kind of a broader picture, so I'm saying the architecture, albeit a very high-level architecture that I'm showing you in the diagram here, is my way of describing a client-side rendering web app architecture. And so on the left, I have my browser. In the middle, I have my web server. And on the right, I have a database, which I don't really care about. But what's noticeable is that the browser, I don't have anything underneath it, as in it doesn't really do anything substantial other than display the web page that has been provided to it by the server. And so the server is, sorry, I've got another button to press here now. The server does everything. It has all of the algorithms or business logic related to the web app. It does all the data processing, as in it interacts with the database and does any data validation and any number crunching, etc., etc. But of particular interest to us here now is the idea that the server is actually responsible for generating the UI. In other words, it generates the HTML and sends that HTML down to the browser. The user interacts with the page that they're seeing, so they may click on a link or click on a button or interact in some way, and that interaction will immediately send another request back to the server. It'll process that particular request, which may involve talking to the database, doing some algorithm, executing some algorithm, but yet again, it is going to generate the completely new user interface that needs to be displayed to the user as a result of that interaction. So it's going to generate the new HTML page, send that down to the browser, it displays it, and on it goes. That's the way the flow of execution works with a client-side rendering web app. And in particular, the server is always generating the new page that is to be displayed back to the user. That's server-side rendering. Client-side rendering, you'll notice now that I have some gears in my browser box. So the browser does actually have some functionality or some logic running in it. And the logic is going to be JavaScript code, okay, which we write, and that JavaScript code will be shipped down to the browser somehow. And the JavaScript code is going to be responsible for generating the UI. So it is actually creating the various views for this particular web app. It's actually generating the HTML, if you like. You could think of it like that. It is generating the HTML dynamically at runtime based on the kind of interaction that the user is engaging with on the app. Every now and again, the functionality that is executing here is going to communicate back to the server, but the purpose of the communication is either A, to send data down to the server, because maybe there's a web form being displayed here and the user fills out the web form, clicks submit, and that data is sent back to the server. The server does some validation and processing of it, puts it in the database. Other occasions, an interaction by the user may cause my browser code, my JavaScript code, to send some sort of a HTTP GET request, which is essentially a request for some data. And however this generates the data, it generates it somehow by talking to the database, more likely, and as well as doing some data processing. And it responds with data in some form. That data arrives here, and the code here then takes that data and stitches it into the page that is being displayed to the user. So now we say that the client is rendering the UI, hence the label client-side rendering. So there are the two primary architectures for web apps, and we are interested in this second architecture. As I was saying a few moments ago, originally there was only server-side rendering, even though that term wasn't used. But then client-side rendering became a popular alternative. And in fairness, server-side rendering is coming back into focus again. So there are real alternatives now from an architecture point of view. There are alternative architectures that you as a developer can decide to choose from. And we won't go into why you might choose one over the other today anyway, but there are. And in fact, there is a third alternative called static site generating as another architectural approach. So we're focusing on client-side rendering, or CSR. This is a slightly more involved description of the architecture of this type of app. So generally, there are actually two servers involved. One server is just an ordinary HTTP web server, a standard web server. And what its purpose is to send the core assets associated with the web app down to the browser, in particular JavaScript, CSS. Now I'm mentioning HTML, but you'll see in a while, once we get into the meat of this module, that there is very, very little raw HTML that you need to code up for one of these client-side rendering web apps. Essentially, all you need to do is to code up a single HTML page with an empty body, and that's it. So that's what's sent down, but there is a significant amount of JavaScript sent down. And it's that JavaScript, as we now know, that JavaScript, once it arrives in the browser, it starts executing straight away. And the first thing it does is it dynamically generates the homepage for this web app. And subsequently, it will be generating the other pages in the web app based on the user's interaction. So initially, this web server kicks in. Once the user kind of browses to the web app, this server is going to respond with those assets. And really, after that, this server is out of the picture. From there on in, all of the interaction that the user has with the web app, some of those interactions may cause a communication between the browser and this second server. The second server is what we refer to as a web API server. So a web API is something that you will be developing, and you'll be finding out about web APIs in the latter half of this module. But you can see here that the communication here is purely data related. There's no web assets as there is up here. This is a my attempt at showing you the communication flow between those three entities in the previous slide. So initially, as I was saying, the browser communicates with the web server, the web server. It responds with the web app assets. And from then on, the communication is between the browser and the web API server. And it's either sending data or it's requesting data. Here, it looks like it's requesting data because it's a HTTP GET request. Down here, it looks like it's a POST request. And we know that a HTTP POST request typically means you're sending data to the server. Now, there's a lot of text here, but this client-side rendering approach has evolved over the years, and it kind of dates back to the early noughties. So the very first generation of these client-side rendering web apps, probably one of the most significant web app of this architecture, was Google's original Gmail client. So I'm saying it's roughly around 2004. So the idea has been around for a while, but the way we develop these CSR web apps has changed significantly since back then. So either way, it involves writing quite a lot of JavaScript code, but back in 2004, in that era, the volume of JavaScript code that we had to write was very significant. There was no good principles and practices in terms of how you should structure your code. So our code was very bloated. It was very difficult to maintain. And I'm saying here that the whole developer experience was very unsatisfactory. Also, the code that we wrote, the JavaScript code that we wrote, we tended to write it for a particular browser base. So it was native to a particular browser rather than being browser agnostic, and that's clearly not a good situation to have. So sometimes in our JavaScript code that we wrote back then, we had to first of all check, well, what type of browser am I running in? And that influenced which part of your JavaScript code ran as a result. So overall, we wrote a lot of raw vanilla JavaScript code, very poorly structured because there was no guidance as to how we should structure it. Very difficult to maintain, and it was browser. It was browser native rather than browser agnostic. Also, I'm saying here that the type of client-side rendering web apps that we wrote back then, they lacked addressability. Now, addressability, as you know, is this idea, if you think of just the static web world, where we just have hyperlinks, and every time we click on a hyperlink, the URL address in the browser changes. Okay, so that we refer to that characteristic of the static web as the addressability characteristic. Now, for the web apps back in the early noughties, we did have this idea of multiple pages making up our web app. But as we transitioned from one page to the next, the URL address in the browser never changed. So hence it lacked addressability. And there are consequences to the fact that it did lack addressability. Moving on then, a jQuery library emerged from the open source community, I think, but this jQuery library significantly helped in this areas up here. It significantly reduced the amount of code that we had to write. But there were still problems, really, even though jQuery was phenomenally successful and still is being used in the industry, because, you know, as well as reducing the volume of code that we had to write, it also allowed our code to be browser agnostic, in the sense that jQuery itself, buried within the library, it took care of discovering what type of browser it was currently executing in and making the necessary adjustments accordingly. So we as developers were spared having to deal with that low-level issue. So jQuery came out around 2006, and as I said, it was extremely popular, essentially because it made the developer's life easier. We still had some problems though, as in we still lacked this addressability characteristic that we would like our app to have. And even though at the time, it dealt with, to a certain degree anyway, it dealt with the code bloat issue. We wrote less code. It still turned out that the code that we wrote was somewhat spaghetti-like in nature. There was no real structure to the code that we wrote, or at least there were no good guidelines as to how we should structure and modularize our code. Moving on then to around 2010, and the whole notion of single-page app frameworks came on the scene, and these dealt with the remaining problems that were still present in the whole developer experience associated with developing client-side rendering web apps. So these single-page app frameworks, they enforced, admittedly, a structure on our code, but the structure was based on good design patterns that were well established in the industry. It dealt with the addressability issue. It dealt with browser incompatibility, all of those things. So much better developer experience. And we're still in this era of the single-page app framework era, and will be the focus of the first half of this module. Now, to be honest, there is a little bit of a kickback against the single-page app approach more recently, as in within the last maybe 2 to 3 years. But it's still going to be around for quite a number of years before it completely dies off, if at all. I'm going to pause for a second just in case there are any questions. Okay, so that's the context. Client-side rendering web apps, which is our focus. The alternative is server-side rendering, which we won't be looking at. Although a lot of the skills that we'll acquire in this are applicable to server-side rendering as well. So in terms of this module, if we go back to this diagram, essentially there are 2 parts to a client-side rendering web app. There's the client part, and then there's the web API part. So in terms of the client side, what we will be using is a framework called React, which you probably have gleaned maybe from, if you flick through these slides at all from before this lecture. So React is going to handle the structuring of our JavaScript code and how we actually write our client side. Essentially, our React is a JavaScript library for building browser-based user interfaces. Now, it sounds pretty straightforward, but it has really become a bit of a juggernaut in the whole client-side rendering web app world, and it has grown and grown. But there you are. Anyway, that's one technology that we'll be spending a lot of time on. On the other side, the server side, where we'll be developing what's called a web API. The technologies that we're going to be using there are Node and Express. Node, as you know, is just a server-side runtime environment for JavaScript. Express then is a framework for developing web APIs. On the database side, we could have picked any database really, but we're going to use MongoDB. It's a non-relational database, as you may have come across before, but we could have picked anyone, but it should be interesting, I think. And it's not really a significant part of the module, arguably. The whole notion of REST as well. REST is a way of designing the interface for your web API, but that's for later on in the module. So this is another way of looking at our technology stack, often referred to as the MERN stack, as in M for Mongo, E for Express, R for React, and N for Node. And what's nice about this stack is that it's essentially JavaScript from end to end. Clearly, the code that we're going to be writing that's going to run in the browser has to be JavaScript based, because that's the only language that runs in the browser. If we ignore the existence of WebAssembly, if you're familiar with WebAssembly. So it's going to be JavaScript here. Our server side is also going to be in JavaScript, but it doesn't have to be. It could be in any language, because the communication between these two is just going to be over HTTP. So HTTP is, again, kind of language agnostic. So we could have used Python here, or Go, or Ruby, or Java, but we are using JavaScript on our server side. And essentially, MongoDB is you could regard it as a database for storing JavaScript objects, if you've come across it at all. That's essentially what it is. So it's kind of JavaScript end to end, which makes life a little bit easier for you, because there's only one language that you have to juggle with. I did say in the opening slide that we were interested in ensuring that we used industry standard frameworks. This is a slide that shows the most used frameworks in the web in 2023, and this has been really the case for the last number of years. And you can see there that Express is number 2, Node number 1, React is number 2, Express is number 4. You can see jQuery there as number 3. The only caveat I would slightly warn against this particular slide is that it is talking about the most used web frameworks, and most used is often a reflection of longevity. So those that have been around the longest would tend to appear high up in this survey. But sometimes newer frameworks are actually better than the older frameworks on a number of criteria. But by virtue of the fact that they're newer on the scene, they haven't established themselves yet in the industry. So most used doesn't always mean best. That's just a slight caveat to what this slide is telling us. But still, it's most used. And so that means, if you're a young graduate and you're looking for employment, then having any of these technologies on your CV is of benefit. This is a rough kind of plan of how we're going to progress through this module. Initially, we're going to have to cover just what I'm calling the fundamentals, and really there is only one fundamental, and that is the JavaScript language. Then we'll move on to focusing on the client side of our CSR app. So we'll be developing the front end first. We'll be using an open source API just to satisfy the back end. So it's open source and it's available to anybody. Then we look at developing our own web API. This probably won't apply. Some years we cover topics like testing, but I'm not sure. It's actually Frank is going to cover the web API side. So whether he decides to include testing or not this year, he will probably decide a little bit later on, depending on how things are going. So that's the module. Next, in terms of what software do you need to install, all fairly predictable stuff. You need to, the editor stroke IDE we use is VS Code. It's really, really popular in the industry as well. So it's almost an industry standard at this stage. We don't really care if you use another text editor environment, but it's what I'll be using in the labs and in the lectures. And I'd encourage you to become familiar with it because of its popularity. And it's just downloaded as an executable. So there's no real complications in installing it. Just go to the website and grab your executable and you're done. Clearly, we're going to be using Node because we're writing JavaScript a lot. And if you don't have Node already on your laptop, you may have. Simplest way you find out is just type the command node space -v to see whether you have it or not. In terms of the version that you have, really anything reasonably recent, as in within the last 3-4 years, is fine. If you don't have Node at all, then just go to the website, which you have, you're seeing a screenshot of here, and make sure that you grab the one here on the left. Don't take the one on the right, because the one on the right is essentially experimental. The one on the left is the what's called the LTS version, the long-term support version. And as I said, okay, I think I took this screenshot last week, so we're up to version 18.x. I don't have 18.x on my machine. I think it's 16 that I use. So, 15 onwards, from version 15 onwards is really fine for this module. We don't have to have the latest and greatest version of it. We will be using Git throughout the labs. So again, most laptops at this stage have Git installed by default. And again, the way you find out whether you've got Git or not is type the command git space -- version to see if you do have it installed. And equally, in terms of versions, it's not really significant. Any version of Git will be fine. VS Code, just in terms of, this is a screenshot of the UI for VS Code. So just in terms of the kind of terminology, what we have on the left are what are called the activity bar. So the main activity is what VS Code refers to as the Explorer activity. So when you click on that, what you see is the files in the project that you're currently working on. The other interesting activity is this one here. VS Code has got excellent integration with Git. And the other one, also VS Code has various plugins or extensions. A very, very large catalog of extensions have evolved, have come on stream over the years. And it's very easy to install these extensions. You just click on this activity here, which is the extensions activity. And there are 1 or 2 extensions that you will need to install in VS Code for our module, but you may find other ones that are useful, and feel free to install them as well. In terms of the layout of VS Code, this is your editor area. This is what's called the panels area. And in particular, one panel that we will use quite a lot is what's referred to as the integrated terminal panel. What that will allow us to do is to submit shell commands or terminal commands or DOS commands, depending on whether you're on a Windows or a Mac system. You can submit those commands from the terminal, the integrated terminal built into VS Code. So there's no need to be switching away from VS Code out to your shell prompt, type your commands there, and then come back to VS Code. It can all happen within the editor itself. Admittedly, a lot of IDEs have that feature now. And you've got a status bar at the very bottom of your of the screen as well. You may have come across this term full stack developer. Well, the title of this module is Enterprise Web Development. That was the title we gave it, gosh, about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. If we were designing the module today and had the exact same content, then a more current name for it would be full stack development instead of enterprise web development. So that's essentially a more modern slant on what this module is all about. And that's it. That's my introduction. I won't go through the summary. I think we should really try and get straight into some essential topics. But again, I'll pause just in case there are any issues, either A, related to what I've told you so far, or if there are other kind of module startup questions that you have that I haven't dealt with. I know people are always interested in assessment, but we might just back off from talking about assessments this early, if that's okay.